to us. Let me just talk about a couple of things, and then if you want to ask questions, I'd be glad to try to talk about what you want to talk about. First of all, I'd say in the campaign last year, early on I thought, well, I've never seen people more engaged in the domestic issues that the country's dealing with. And I didn't have to think about that very long to think, well, of course they're engaged. This is not a time when the focus of the country or the focus of the campaign is what's your family position on the defensive missile shield. This is about people's jobs and their taxes and their health care and why the government's spending so much money. And the two big questions before the country today are, where are the private sector jobs, and why is the federal government spending so much more money than it's ever spent in any terms you could compare to since World War II? And what are we going to do about it? And by the way, part of the answer to the question, where are the private sector jobs, is found by stopping some of this government spending. No matter how bad you think things are in Washington relative to spending, they're worse. And people, I think, are beginning to know that on both sides of the aisle, and we'll see if we're willing to do anything about it or not. I think we're really at a moment in the history of the country. We have been for a couple of years, and we will be for the next couple of years, where we're deciding what kind of country we want to be. Do we want to do what most of the countries in the world have done and be willing to live in a country where the government is clearly bigger than the people, and the government assumes more of the responsibilities of daily life all the time? Or do we want to still be a country where the people are bigger than the government? I know what side of that I'm on. I know what side of that the American people are on right now. But this last election and the next one are going to have a lot to say about that question. I mean, why are we spending so much money? We're spending so much money because the government's taken too many responsibilities that previously were left to individuals and families. And of course there needs to be a safety net. But there needs to be an understanding that the government, just like we can't do individually, can't spend more money than is available to be spent, can't spend more money than they should be spending as a portion of the economy. I'm not going to give you a bunch of numbers here today, but I'll give you two. And one is $3.8 trillion, and the other is $2.2 trillion. The $3.8 trillion is the amount of money we're in the process of spending at the federal level. The federal government will spend this year. The $2.2 trillion is the amount of money the federal government expects to collect this year. Now those numbers don't work. And we're going to have added $3 trillion to the federal debt in 2 years' time. It took the rest of the history of the country to get the first $10 trillion, and we're adding $3 trillion to it in 2 years' time. And the numbers, we have to figure out a way to equalize those two numbers to where the spending number and the income number are the same. And if that doesn't happen, we're going to be in as much trouble as every other country that's got those things out of balance is in, like Greece and Ireland and Portugal and Japan. And we still have time to do something about this, but we don't have a lot of time to do something about it. We've got to get on a path where those things equal out. And the problem is not that the American people are not paying enough taxes. The problem is the federal government is spending too much money. There are only so much in taxes that Americans will spend, and since World War II, the Americans have never been willing, the federal government has never collected more than 19% of the capacity of the country to create goods and services in taxes. No matter how high the tax rate was, the federal government has never collected more than 19% of GDP. And during a lot of that time, from World War II until now, the top tax rate was 70, 80, 90%. But nobody ever paid that tax rate very many times straight. Matter of fact, I was reading in the centennial year of President Reagan's birth, a story about President Reagan. One of the reasons he was so committed to cut taxes in 1981 when the top rate was 70% is he understood that people don't pay the 70% rate. And in fact, when he was in his His other career, when he got to 70%, the 70% bracket, he quit working for the year. Now, this is the same guy that said hard work never killed anybody, but why take a chance? So he had the capacity to quit working once in a while, but he was certainly going to quit working when the federal government was taking 70% of everything he was making, and then the state of California was probably taking another 8 or 9% of everything he was making, and there's just no reason, the incentive to work. If you ask the Congressional Budget Office or the Office of Management and Budget, who calculates all these things in a static environment. That's why they think tax cuts always cost money to the federal government instead of produce money, because they produce more workers. If you ask the Office of Management and Budget, what would happen if you had a 100% tax rate on every dollar everybody earns, they'd add up all the payrolls in the country and say, well, at a 100% tax rate, we'd take in whatever that number is. Well, you and I know that a whole bunch of people wouldn't be working if the tax rate was 100%. So you can set the tax rate as high as you want, but that doesn't mean it's going to result in more revenue. But if you set the tax rate much higher than it is right now, my view is that people just don't take the risk necessary to create opportunity for other people. You know, if there's one principle that you need to understand in the economy, in an economy like ours, the principle is risk reward. If you don't reward extraordinary risk, people don't take extraordinary risk. And if people don't take risk, they don't create opportunity. And if the federal government is competing for too much of the money out there available to be had, that means it's harder for other people to get it and less likely to have the private sector job creation you need. So we've got to figure out how we make these government programs work in a better way. Some of them a little easier to solve than others. Social Security has about 3, maybe 4 moving parts. And if you wanted to solve this problem for the next 7 or 8 decades, you can solve the problem by sitting down and saying, okay, what are we going to do about age of retirement? What are we going to do about taxing some of Social Security benefits at some level for people that clearly don't need Social Security even though they've paid into it? What is a point where Social Security is more taxable than it is now? And what do you do about people contributing to the system? And how does that all work out to solve that problem? Health care, a little harder to solve. But the so-called mandatory part of the federal budget, and this is more by coincidence than anything else, last year and this year spent about $2.2 trillion. Now that happens to be the same number I gave you earlier that we collected. So Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and a few other mandatory spending items like interest on the debt was $2.2 trillion. That means for everything else that the federal government did last year, we borrowed the money. For every military uniform we bought, for every bullet we purchased, for every Pell Grant we gave a kid going to college, all of that was borrowed money from some individual here or in another country or from some other government. And that is absolutely, totally unsustainable. And that's why I'm for several different versions of a balanced budget amendment. One I've co-sponsored, but I could be for a lot of others if it would get us there. And one of the things we're talking about now that nobody has talked about very much in the past is those balanced budget amendments needs to have some targeted spending that's the maximum amount the federal government can spend, like 20% of last year's GDP, because that's about all you're ever going to be able to tax out of the American economy and not have negative impact on the economy. Certainty, also important as you work to create jobs. A certainty of the taxes you're likely to pay with any profit you hope to make. Certainty in what your health care costs are going to be. And by the way, there are a lot better ways to reform the current health care system than the health care bill that we're heading toward right now. A lot of which we sent to the Senate year after year when I was in the House of Representatives, things like medical liability reform and association health plans. Sometimes we call them small business health plans, buying across state lines, more competition for people who are competitors to get your health insurance business, rather than just hoping that one of the 3 or 4 people that could sell you insurance, or 3 or 4 companies that could sell you insurance, might do it. Regulations. People in our state figured out not too long into this cap and trade discussion that cap and trade, as it passed the House of Representatives in 2009, would double the utility bills in Missouri in about a dozen years. And so in probably September last year, I was talking to a guy who I'm pretty sure didn't have an economics degree. He was an hourly employee somewhere, and here's what he said. And he was well aware, as most people were in our state as the discussion went on last year, that his utility bill could double in a decade or close to a decade if the discussion in Washington actually resulted in legislation. And he said, look, if my utility bill doubles, that's a bad thing. If my retired mother's utility bill doubles, that's a worse thing. But if the utility bill at work doubles and my job goes away, the other 2 bills don't matter much anyway, because I can't pay mine and I can't help my mother pay hers. As it turned out, that guy just happened to have a PhD in common sense. Because exactly what would happen to many of our jobs if the utility bill doubles is they would go away, and they wouldn't go somewhere else in the United States. They'd go somewhere that cares a whole lot less about what comes out of the smokestack than we do. And so the ultimate Washington lose-lose. Not only would we lose the jobs, but we would make the problem that we were trying to solve, assuming the CO2 problem, worse, not better. And so we've got to be realistic about the impact of what the government's doing. We've got to be very vigilant that the regulators aren't allowed to do what the legislators won't do. And we've also got to be realistic that the legislators don't opt out and say, well, we don't have the courage to do something that needs to be done, so we're going to make the regulators do it. But in this case, this is not a plan that needs to happen. We need to be focused on more American energy. Of everything out there, the one thing we know there's a guaranteed marketplace for is energy. The one thing we know that for decades we've used more than we could create is energy. And so we ought to be looking at how we meet that need in our own economy in the best possible way. If Egypt and Libya and Algeria are not a reminder to us that it's dangerous to be dependent on economies and resources that we have no certainty of having access to, I don't know what would remind us of that. So more American energy of all kinds, more American fossil fuels, more natural gas, more oil, more coal used in more effective ways. And there's going to be plenty of increased demand for electricity. Most of the estimates I see indicate that by 2030, sometime in the decade of the 2030s, we will be using twice as much electricity as we use today in the country. And if that's the case, you don't have to dismantle the current utility infrastructure to encourage adding on to it with new sources. And they can be solar, and they can be wind, and they can be natural gas, and they can be nuclear. But to begin to penalize the structure we have now only hurts our job-creating potential in America, and particularly in the vast heartland of America, where more than 50% of the energy is created is coal-generated from the middle of Pennsylvania to the western edge of Wyoming. And so we've got to be sure that the government is doing is helping create an environment where private sector individuals create jobs. Government jobs don't pay the bill, they are part of the bill. And we need a few of them, but we don't need more of them than we need. And if we have too many of them, they begin to impact the private sector market. Somebody gave me an example at St. Joseph last year. that was, he said, an example he'd heard in business graduate school at Harvard 30 years earlier, 40 years earlier, and this was the example, thinking about the public sector and the private sector. So just imagine everybody standing on the ground is holding up a platform, and everybody on top of the platform are the people who work for the government. How many people can you take from under the platform and put on top of the platform until the platform collapses? And so while you're here talking to the people that work for you in Jefferson City, remember that that's part of the discussion. Let's not get so many people on top of the platform that the people under the platform, the people that are so represented by the Missouri Chamber of Commerce, that the people under the platform can no longer hold the platform up. Let's continue to live in a country where the government is bigger than the people. Let's not live in a country where the people, let's continue to live in a country where the people are bigger than the government, not where the government's bigger than the people. So.